Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly analyze the main tactical themes in Man City's 2-1 win at Aston Villa. So in today's video, first we're going to focus on Aston Villa's defensive shape, then we'll shift to Guardiola's tactical approach, and then lastly we'll focus on Gerrard's second half adjustment and how Guardiola's side were able to create openings. So when we break down the game and we do look at the board, we have City starting in a 4-2-3-1, and Aston Villa were supposed to be in a 4-3-3, but it very much looked like a 4-3-2-1. What we ended up seeing from Villa was that when they dropped off into their defensive shape, they were expecting City to obviously dominate possession, but what we ended up seeing was that they were focused on having Bailey and Buendia tucking into those narrow central positions to occupy Rodri and Fernandinho. That allowed Ake and Ruben Dias to have a 2v1 advantage against Watkins, and the only way to combat that would be to have either Bailey or Buendia helping Watkins step forward to press the center backs, and while doing that they would be blocking off the passing lane into their marker. So if Buendia was stepping towards Ruben Dias because Watkins was near Ake, Buendia would be blocking off the passing lane into Fernandinho, and vice versa. If Watkins shifted over to Ruben Dias, Bailey would step towards Ake and be blocking off the passing lane into Rodri. However, that does create gaps in those wider areas for City to receive the ball. So if the ball is shifted out to Zinchenko, McGinn would shift over to deal with him. And if the ball was shifted out to Cancelo, that would be Douglas Luiz's task of closing down the right back, with Nakamba being tasked with dealing with Bernardo Silva or protecting the center of the pitch in case Gabriel Jesus dropped off deeper into that midfield zone. That ultimately means that out in those wider areas, it'd be Sterling against Cash and Mahrez against Target. And given the fact that Pep Guardiola did start Sterling and Mahrez in those wider areas, it was clear that he wanted to get those players in 1v1s against the fullbacks. How did he do that? Well, if Bailey and Buendia weren't consistently stepping out to the spare center back, there was always a free center back to slide the ball out into those wider areas. For example, over on the left-hand side, Zinchenko was adopting a narrow position to pull out McGinn, and that created the avenue for Ake to consistently slide the ball out to Sterling, who was holding the touchline. That was a common theme for Man City, and there were often times where you had Zinchenko making those forward runs to drag away McGinn, and then that's how City were able to slide the ball out into those zones. Meanwhile, over on the right-hand side, Cancelo was closed down by Douglas Luiz, as stated previously, and if he moved into those central areas, that would create a gap for Mahrez. But what we often saw was that Bernardo Silva was shifting into the gaps between the center backs and the fullbacks. Gabriel Jesus was dropping off into midfield, but because Bernardo Silva was occupying those narrow positions, he was pulling away Target and Mings, and that would create an avenue for City's central midfielders, their center backs, or Sterling cutting in central to switch the ball out to Mahrez, who would now be a free man because of Bernardo Silva's positioning. If we stick to that right-hand side, one of the issues that Aston Villa encountered was that there were times where Buendia was stepping into the path of Ruben Dias, and Douglas Luiz was now looking to step towards Fernandinho, and that would create an avenue for Fernandinho to slide the ball out towards Cancelo. The other issue that they could have was that if Douglas Luiz and Buendia were caught stepping towards Fernandinho or Rodri, then that would leave Cancelo free, and what would end up happening was that now you would have Bernardo Silva either dropping into that gap with Cancelo also free, or there were even times where you had Bernardo Silva simply occupying that gap between Mings and Target, pulling away the center back, and then with Target focused on Mahrez, Cancelo was now free to run into the final third to serve as a creative option. Whereas when we look to the left-hand side, what you often saw in the early stages was that City were consistently getting Sterling into 1v1s against Cash, or at times it was up against McGinn because you would have Bernardo Silva in that gap between Cash and Konsa as well. In many ways, that does create a 3v2 if Zinchenko does push forward into that narrow position, but that's where you need Nakamba to shift across to help out and make it a 3v3 and track the movement of Bernardo Silva, or if he's not tracking the movement of Bernardo and it's Cash or McGinn tracking that movement, then he has to be focused on Zinchenko making that forward run. If we look to an example, it's Sterling pulling out Cash, and you can see Bernardo Silva making a run off McGinn as Zinchenko's also making an underlapping run to pull out Nakamba. When Sterling slides the ball across Cash, you can see that McGinn does track the movement of Bernardo Silva, and Nakamba places himself in left half space to occupy Zinchenko, and that creates a 3v3 with help from Konsa, that halts City's attack down the left-hand side. The other alternative for City was that if Bernardo was stuck on that right-hand side between Mings and target, Gabriel Jesus could shift and occupy Cash, and then if McGinn is closing down Zinchenko, if he slides the ball out to Sterling, now Cash has to come out, and that's where you need Nakamba to shift over, because Konsa was often retreating in towards the 6-yard box for the pullback. Due to Villa's narrow shape, this was a reoccurring theme for City in that first half. And it was no surprise that a Sterling 1v1 played a key role in the opening goal. Here we have Sterling in a 1v1 with McGinn, and you have Bernardo Silva occupied by Cash and Nakamba, and Zinchenko ahead of the penalty area. What Sterling does well here is that he shimmies and he carries the ball towards the byline, and that's where he gains a yard on McGinn to carry it into left half space, and that's going to pull out Cash. What happens next is that as Sterling breaks towards the byline, Cash holds his position, but that's where you end up seeing Sterling locating Ruben Dias free at the edge of the box, and he pulls it across all the Aston Villa retreating defenders, and that places Ruben Dias in this position where he does pull out Bailey, but that's how City are able to take the lead. In terms of City's pressing, what you ended up seeing was that they did drop off into 2 banks of 4, and that's where you would see Gabriel Jesus and Bernardo Silva stepping towards Konsa and Mings, but we're taking turns dealing with Nakamba. So if Jesus stepped towards one center back, Bernardo Silva would drop to Nakamba and vice versa. And if they were looking to sit off and retreat and allow the center backs on the ball, Gabriel Jesus and Bernardo Silva would sit in between Nakamba, and that's where you would see Sterling and Mahrez closing down targeting Cash. In terms of City's press from goal kicks, it was Sterling and Mahrez stepping towards Konsa and Mings and blocking off the passing lane in towards the fullbacks, and then when Nakamba looked to drop off deeper, Gabriel Jesus and Bernardo Silva were sitting in between the defensive midfielder. Of the few issues that City encountered in that opening half, what you ended up seeing was that in terms of their pressing, it was Buendia and Bailey dropping off in towards their own third to receive the ball from the fullbacks. And that's where you would see Fernandinho being pulled out to close down Buendia and Rodri holding the center of the pitch, and vice versa. If you ended up having Bailey dropping off into his own half, it would be Rodri or Fernandinho stepping towards him, and the free central midfielder protecting the center of the pitch. Here you could see a breakdown in City's pressing after they lose possession in the final third, and it's Target slotting the ball across Fernandinho caught out of position for Buendia pulling out Rodri, and you have McGinn and Bailey free to the left of Rodri. When Buendia receives the ball, because Rodri doesn't get tight towards him, he ends up backheeling the ball into the path of McGinn, and that creates the 2v1, and when Rodri looks to shift across to close down McGinn, you have Buendia making a forward run towards the halfway line, and McGinn simply slides the ball across the City defensive midfielder to ignite the counterattack. The only other real variation that we witnessed from Villa was if McGinn dropped off in towards an inside right position, and it would be Sterling stepping towards him and Zinchenko dealing with Cash. Therefore, the only real threat that Aston Villa were causing City was in transition. A lot of it stemmed through Watkins checking in towards the ball, pulling out the center backs and linking play with his teammates, or simply when Villa were able to bypass Rodri with combination play, along with a brief period where Cash was able to make runs into that gap because the City fullbacks were caught higher up the pitch. In terms of the second half, besides Ashley Young replacing Bailey, who was unable to continue due to injury, what we ended up witnessing was that over on Villa's right-hand side, rather than having McGinn instantly step out towards Zinchenko, he was allowing Zinchenko to step forward, and he was blocking off the passing lane into Bernardo Silva, who was positioning himself into the gap between Cash and Konsa, and he was simply waiting for Nakamba to shift over to provide cover before he would step to Zinchenko. This was successful down that right-hand side, and what you ended up seeing was that City's threat down that left-hand side diminished. Sterling was struggling to win his 1v1s with Cash, and even when you had Gabriel Jesus shifting over into that zone, they were fairly organized and not wary of the movement of Bernardo Silva. The only real issue that they encountered down that flank was when Ashley Young was looking to shift over to close down Zinchenko, as it did allow Rodri to be the spare man in that central area, and when he did receive the ball, he was looking to switch it out towards Mahrez to place him in a 1v1 situation. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side, Bernardo Silva had more success creating those combination plays and getting in behind the fullbacks. While Nakamba did a very good job of shifting into that gap between Cash and Konsa to close him down. Over on the right hand side, when Mahrez was pulling out target, Bernardo Silva was positioning himself in that gap between Mings and the left back, and then making runs in behind the left back to receive the ball from target. It was clear that City were trying to pull out Mings so that Bernardo Silva can have the pullback, but Mings was often retreating into that central position along with Nakamba. Here, despite Mahrez sliding the ball across Ashley Young for Bernardo Silva in right half space, you could see that either Mings has to shift over or Douglas Luiz has to track back because he was focused on Cancelo. But even though Bernardo Silva receives the ball freely in right half space, Douglas Luiz does a very good job of tracking that run and blocking the pullback, even though you could see that Mings, Konsa, and Nakamba were prepared for that delivery. The only real way for Aston Villa to deal with that threat is by having Ruben Dias shifting over to deal with Cancelo, Douglas Luiz tracking the movement of Bernardo Silva, and then on those situations, having Watkins dropping off to close down for Nandinho. We did see Bernardo Silva often shifting towards the right touchline as well and having Mahrez shift into those central areas. And ultimately, City's best chance in that second half was created down that right-hand side due to the breakdown from Aston Villa's left-hand side and not having one of the center backs or Nakamba tracking the movement of Bernardo Silva. Here you can see that Bernardo Silva and Mahrez have swapped positions. So what Mahrez does well here is that he drops off deeper in a narrow inside right position to pull out Young. And what you can see on that right hand side is an overload because Douglas Luiz isn't looking to step towards Cancelo, and you can see that Bernardo Silva's free to make a run in beyond Young. You have Ruben Dias sitting on Fernandinho and Nakamba as the free man. What needs to happen here is that there needs to be a shift with either Douglas Luiz stepping towards Cancelo, Young shifting over to Bernardo Silva, and Nakamba dropping off deeper. Or you need Nakamba to step towards Cancelo so that Douglas Luiz can shift laterally to deal with Bernardo. Because neither is done, Cancelo's passing range exploits the poor positioning and decision making of Aston Villa, and he clips the ball over Douglas Luiz and Ashley Young to place him in a right channel position to pull out Mings, and that's where you could see that he's able to play a first time ball for Gabriel Jesus making a run across Konsa, and from there it places Gabriel Jesus in this position where he's able to spin away from Konsa, and he should be killing off the game, but he scuffs his effort wide of the net. So as you can see, Guardiola exploited Aston Villa's narrow defensive shape in the opening half through quick switches and sterling 1v1s, but despite Gerrard's minor tactical tweak, Bernardo Silva's positioning remained a threat throughout.